Hello and welcome to On Point. This episode features an interview with Rob Schneider, Chief Content Development and Strategy Officer at Learfield. Rob has an accomplished background in corporate development and strategy. He drives innovation and acceleration across the content, data, and digital product teams at Learfield. In this role, he strategizes on how to support growth and development within the sports, media, and entertainment industries. Rob currently serves on the advisory boards of Stadia Ventures, Courtside Ventures, and Big Media Holdings. Rob served in the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army as an infantry officer, graduating with honors from the United States Military Academy, and earned his MBA at the Columbia Business School. In this episode of On Point, Rob talks about why he commissioned for infantry and why networking was so important to help him advance professionally after serving in the military. He discusses the steps it took to get his career started, including the importance of transitioning to new experiences and executive leadership roles. Rob also provides insights on sports and video gaming and how Learfield is at the forefront of their future. Now, please enjoy this interview between Rob Schneider and your hosts, Tim Shaw and Lance Dietz.
Welcome to On Point. I'm Tim Shaw, class of 2004.
And I'm Lance Dietz, class of 2008.
And today we're joined by Rob Schneider. Rob, how are you?
I'm doing well, guys. Thanks for having me.
We're going to get into our first segment, AAR, or for our non-military listeners, After Action Review. In this segment, we'd like to touch on specifically what other veterans can learn from you, your process, and your journey. Could you please share your decision to attend West Point?
I grew up in a family where service was really integral to our being. My grandmother, she grew up in Nazi Germany. My father escaped from communist Romania. Being an American and all that means in terms of our freedoms was something I had real firsthand experience in terms of what it meant when you didn't have those things. At the same time, I've always been drawn to the arts and the creative endeavors. I grew up outside of Woodstock, New York, which, as the name implies, there's a lot of truth to that. It's a heavy concentration of the creative class up there. And whether it was service or something more creatively oriented, it's always been important to me to be part of something that's bigger and more meaningful and more impactful than just your typical 9-to-5 job. Going back specifically to your question, though, in terms of deciding on West Point, my decision was really between West Point and NYU Film School. So two very different roads to go down in life. And I knew I couldn't wake up when I was 40 and decide that was the time I wanted to join the Army. So it was pretty straightforward in terms of what path to take first. What I didn't really appreciate at the time was how complementary those two sort of endeavors really are. Generally, when people think about the military, they think about training and rules and rigidity, things not typically associated with creativity. But in reality, that importance of the discipline, the leadership, decision-making that the military instills is because you have to operate in such a sort of high-stakes, ambiguous environment with limited and imperfect information and resources. And so I can't think of anything that's more creative than that. So I think set me up well for when I got out and returned to my other passion, which was being involved in creative fields, media, entertainment, and the like.
Let's talk a bit more, though, about West Point. I saw you were double major. That's no easy feat. I saw that you're a golden child given the bicentennial class. Could you elaborate on your West Point experience?
Yeah, happy to. I was a double major. I was a glutton for punishment. That's to say the least. It was always about trying to maximize the experience, particularly for me at West Point. I was probably more academically oriented than military oriented. When I was there, I never had the shiny shoes, although I never really walked a ton of hours or anything like that. I was pretty down the middle in that regard. But on the academic side, definitely leaned into that. And frankly, probably could have graduated a semester or two early if it was just if they allowed for something like that, just based on the amount of credits. But I just had great teachers, great classes, and I just didn't want to leave any rock unturned.
Were there any mentors or classes or any things that stood out at the time? And now looking back also.
One of the things I really learned there and then took it to grad school and just really life in general is it's so much more about like the P's. It's so much more about the teachers than the courses. I got way more out of a course that, like, if you read the sort of syllabus, you might say, it doesn't sound that interesting. But then working with a really great instructor, one of my majors was comparative politics. Colonel Jeb, eventually General, in Dean, was one of the instructors, was leading that major actually, and she was amazing. Colonel Parker who taught international relations. Just phenomenal class, really just taught you how to think. It was probably the most intellectually challenging class I took at West Point. And so it was so much more. I remember them even more than the subject matter. But besides the teachers, it was my classmates and what they added to the academic experience that I think is pretty unique to West Point as well. Personally, I breezed through high school, if you will. And West Point was the first time where I was like, wow, if you work hard, it really makes a big difference in terms of the results you get. And I've never been around people that were as dedicated to what they were doing than when I showed up at West Point.
A few more West Point related questions, just because a lot of our listeners are clearly grads, but also some cadets, which is when you thought about commissioning, why infantry and why the 82nd?
It goes back to what I said about why be a double major, because if you're in, for a penny, you're in for a pound. And I didn't know at the time whether I was going to be in for 5 years or 20 years or 30 years or whatever, but I knew if I was only going to be in for 5, and I ended up being in for a little bit longer than that, but certainly didn't make a career in the military, that I wanted to get dirty. I wanted to do what the Army is really all about, which for me meant the infantry. And then taking that to further extreme, where's the craziest place you can go straight out? And that's where you're jumping out of airplanes and being a paratrooper. And it was a pretty big shock, I think, for most of my friends and classmates, both of those decisions, because I definitely wasn't the sort of HUA guy out there. I wasn't sporting a high and tight as a cadet or in the 82nd. But it wasn't really about that to me. It was just about being at the pinnacle of your profession. And for me, that, felt like the infantry in the 82nd is the best place to go to experience that.
A number of our listeners are transitioning veteran and would love to hear, because Lance is going to talk about what you're doing now. Can you talk about your transition experience from the military?
Yeah, again, I had a very specific thought about what I wanted to do when I got out, and that was about being in the media. And actually, frankly, I'd forgotten about that as a cadet and serving as an officer, because you're pretty focused as you need to be at the task at hand. And I started thinking about it when I was deployed to Iraq, and just being exposed early in the war. We had a lot of documentary filmmakers and other types of folks attached to us. And that's where we got gears turning again. And when I came back, what can I do to see if this is something that I really wanted to do? And being stationed down at Bragg, I wasn't too far away from Duke. And so started taking some filmmaking classes. And that's where I discovered that, okay, the creative stuff, I'm good at it. But where I really excelled was helping everyone else get their projects in on time. It was like being able to manage the more operational business sides of the creative process. So the next step for me is, okay, I do really want to work in the media field, but it's probably from more of a business perspective than truly being the guy behind the camera or writing the script or something of that nature. And so that's why I went to business school versus film school, although I went to business school in New York because I knew I wanted to be close to a school that had a film school that was close to the entertainment industry. Because the other part of the transition was really just getting out there and networking like crazy, because it wasn't a pipeline. It's not like going to investment banking or consulting where there's a pipeline, and especially a pipeline for grads and officers and folks from the military. So I just had to start knocking on doors, and people, they did not put 2 and 2 together about why the military and why media made sense. They didn't get the things I touched on earlier about the fact that the Army actually sets you up to be creative, because you have to be when you're dealing with life and death and ambiguous situations. So it was networking. It was finding grads that I could reach out to, and they were very helpful to me. And once I got a couple names on my resume, it really set me on my path.
So real quick before Lance's section on present day, Lance and I have definitely benefited from the USMA Long Gray Line network. And you talked about networking. Are there any West Point grads that helped with that transition?
Oh, definitely. My first job, which I had while I was still in business school with John Sabino's a 96 grad, I was having informational interviews with everyone, grads and non-grads alike, alumni from my business school, et cetera. And I think it was within 5 minutes of the conversation with John, where he was like, "Do you just want a job?" And I was like, "Yes, please." And he brought me on board. NBC at the time was owned by General Electric, who obviously has a great pipeline for military recruits. So that's how he entered in and, ended up at NBC as part of a the larger GE relationship, set me on his way. And then unfortunately, there isn't that many grads in the media and entertainment space. I've socialized with some Naval Academy grads here and there as well. They've been helpful as well, because at the end of the day, it's all the same. It's all the same brotherhood.
I feel like we could spend a lot more time on your background in the military, Rob, but let's head into the next segment. This is what we call the sit rep, or the situation report. In this segment, we like to dive into what you're focused on now, your experience since the military, and how you're transforming the future of society and the industry. And I think your background since the military is incredible. Like, it's been across media, across strategy, across corporate development, across private investing. So if you don't mind, could you give us just a little bit of background in terms of how you landed at Learfield and what the path was since the military?
It really started at NBC, as I mentioned, and working more on the monetization side of media. So further refining that down, finding out where my strengths were, where my interests were, but also where the opportunities were. And I loved working there. And I was working there while I was in business school, but my intention was to work there full time afterwards and trying to find a full time position there. And to a T, everyone I spoke to in senior positions at NBC were all fantastic. We're like, we do things in a certain way. You got to wait for someone to die or retire before you get promoted. The guidance they were giving to me, if I was at your stage of life, all the rest of it, they were like, go off, try something a bit riskier, try to go where there's tailwind. And I really took that to heart. And especially at the time, this was 2008, 2009, the convergence of the media industries and the technology industries were still pretty nascent, like relatively nascent. And so I focused my attention really at that intersection, and was lucky enough to find a job in the advertising world within a subsidiary of WPP that was really at the forefront of what's called programmatic advertising, which was really those annoying ads that, shoes that follow you around on the internet. But hey, it was great business, still is. And ultimately, what we were doing was helping make ads way more relevant for folks. And that has gone through a lot of evolution over the last decade or so to deliver on that promise and evolve beyond just following you around on the internet. But the moral of the story is that being at a place where there's just rising tides allowed me to get experiences in terms of business growth, in terms of corporate leadership, that I never would have gotten going to a more established firm first. Really, you have to take advantage of those opportunities. You can't just sit there and let it happen to you, but being in that environment was just so energizing. And so that set me on a path where, I was part of a business unit there that grew tremendously and ended up then going back into the larger corporate ranks within WPP, where at the end of my run there, I was leading a global corporate development for a subsidiary called Group M, which is the largest media buying agency in the world. So 1 out of every 3 or 4 ads that you see on television or on your phone or wherever is bought by someone that works for Group M. So that was a great opportunity working for a company that offices in 95 countries around the world and 40,000 or so people. And it was great. But what I was missing was, again, just more ownership of what I was doing, the impact that I could have as an individual, being part of an industry that, is more team and mission oriented in a purposeful way. Not that Group M and WPP weren't great. They were fantastic. And I grew up there. But Learfield, which is the largest multimedia rights holder in college athletics, so really any way that you can monetize, like if the NCAA is the back office administration of college athletics, Learfield is really the front office, the front door to how fans buy tickets, buy merchandise, how sponsors engage with fans. We have the largest business units in all of those areas. And so I had an opportunity to come here and run strategy, corporate development, as well as many of those business units. And over time, I've run just about every business unit within the organization. But right now I'm focused on, in addition to strategy and corporate development, on all of our media efforts, all of the content that we create and distribute, and ultimately our direct to consumer engagement strategy.
No, I mean, it's just so incredible. Like, you spent, right, like 8 years or so at WPP. PP, if I'm correct. I think that's pretty atypical nowadays for a lot of people coming out of the military and going to business school, going to 2 to 3 years at consulting or finance or at a startup and bouncing around. I'm really curious what kept you there for that long. Was it the team? Was it new responsibilities? Just curious why you stayed and how that was.
I mean, I've always been someone that tries to commit to something. That's why I didn't want to go consulting or banking or anything else, because most of those jobs tend to only be 2 or 3 years in a lot of cases. Obviously, people make careers there as well. But I had a lot of folks 2 or 3 years out of business school calling me up, trying to get a job in my industry that I had 2 or 3 years before. So, having that focus, and it's fine if you don't and you're still trying to figure things out, but I did have an inkling of what I wanted to do. So just jumping right in made a lot of sense to me. Why I stayed was certainly the team, and I had great mentors within the organization that looked out for me and helped me. So that was a big part of it. And many of them had moved on, but shortly before I left. But it was also the opportunities. It was a big organization. I had a different job every 2 or 3 years within that organization of increasing impact and responsibility. So it was, again, very fortunate in that regard to have both mentors within the organization as well as just the opportunity to continue to grow and evolve within it.
And for moving to Learfield and taking on that role, executive leadership team, can you talk a little bit more just about how you thought about that process, in terms of a transition to a new opportunity, how you weighed who you'd be working with and for and what you'd be doing? And were there any people that you called upon, any grads, I guess, specifically, that you sought advice from as you were thinking about this new opportunity?
At the end of the day, whether it's the courses you take or who you work with, as people say, you don't leave jobs, you leave bosses, you leave people. And again, that's not why I left Group M necessarily at all. I loved the people I was working with there, but it was an organization in change. And what really attracted me to Learfield, first of all, it was the opportunity. It was the ability to take something with such a great foundation like college athletics and really take a lot of the advances that I had seen and been a part of around data and analytics and media and advertising and apply that to this business that frankly hadn't had to evolve in the way that, say, newspapers had, because very few people probably walk around the airport with a New York Times shirt on, but they definitely walk around with their college colors. It's just a stronger foundation for media business, which is really what it is at the end of the day. So I thought I could bring a lot of, and hopefully I have a lot of impact to the organization. But at the end of the day, it was about the people. And it was very clear that they, from who they were to the values they had, that they were as close to the military as I had seen from the perspective, again, of mission and purpose and team. And one of our core values as a company is to love and serve others. What kind of company do you hear has the word love in their value statement? And so, you can look at it, maybe it's a little hokey, what have you, but it really speaks to the fact that there's this real personal element and attachment to the way they approach business. And that's something that was really attractive to me.
Oh, that's super interesting. You joined in late 2018, and then the pandemic hit not too long after that, a couple years after. I'm curious, and it was a huge impact sports, live sports, pro sports, probably Learfield significantly. Curious just what that was like being a few years into the role and how you managed to lead the team and the org through that.
It was tough. I mean, there's no other way to say it on so many different levels. Take the impact for a business out of the equation. It feels somewhat trite to even talk about it in the context of everything else that the world has had to gone through in the course of that. But having said that, there certainly were some silver lining as well, thankfully. A lot of the things that specifically I had come on board to do and built a team, both of new people as well as people within the organization to do, was to evolve the fan experience when there's no games, or if there's games and there's no fans and stands. It's certainly, it's not a nice to, it's a need to in terms of evolving that fan experience. So all the things that we were already working on, we went from crawl, walk, run to run, skip, jump, teleport, something. Like we were, moving fast, but still moving in the same direction. We weren't going left and now we're going right. It just pulled everything forward in terms of what we needed to do as a company, what the industry needed to do for themselves and for their fans. And so I think as tough as the last couple of years have been. It's also, from a business perspective, mind you, I think it's set us on a path that will return some significant dividends for everyone.
It's pretty incredible. As you think about the future, I know you've done a lot in the esports and gaming world too, as of late, the past year or two, just given kind of the transition or the intersection that's happened between traditional sports and gaming. Curious if you can elaborate on some of the stuff that you're doing in that world now, in that space, and how Learfield is sort of approaching esports and gaming.
Yeah, so gaming has been definitely one of those areas that's been pulled forward. We were thinking and dabbling in esports prior to the pandemic, but again, it was an area that got greatly accelerated as a result of it. It was an area where participating from home was definitely possible. And so we were able to put on competitions, tournaments, and the like in the midst of the pandemic without losing a beat. And so, in the course of what's now been just a little over a year and a half, we launched what is now the largest collegiate esports in the country called Level Next. We have official partnerships, obviously, with all the schools that we already work with, which is about 85% of the Power 5 schools out there, but as well as all of the major publishers. So as an example, EA was a founding member of Level Next with us, and we are the official home of all of their national championships. So we've done 2 national championships for Madden NFL. We're about to do the first college national championship for FIFA, but we've also run national tournaments with Rocket League and some other titles as well. So it's really been exciting to see that intersection between the traditional college sports fan, but also the esports fan, bring in a whole new demographic of folks that may not be watching football or basketball on the weekend, but are still really proud to represent their universities. And it's been great to give them, that opportunity to do so and to provide fans with a new experience as well.
We're going to move on to the next segment, but before we do so, I want to do some rapid fire quick questions, given your love of film and content. Favorite movies?
Favorite movies? Oh, that's so broad. I can go in so many different...
Just a few. How about just a few, and you have to start with non-military ones and then some military ones.
Non-military movies that I'm a big fan of. It's everything from, it's so eclectic, probably not uncommon. I mean, I grew up on all of the great 80s movies, and I think they inform so much of who I am, whether that's Star Wars or John Hughes movies or what have you. And being able to experience that with my kids now is really fantastic, watching the Goonies with them for the first time. So those... maybe not the best movies of all time from a cinematic perspective, but a movie that stays with you like that is definitely at the top of my list. If you want to look at the more higher quality cinema, I mean, how do you go wrong with Lawrence of Arabia or Citizen Kane or something like that? On the military side, Red Dawn, top of my list. That's probably why I joined the Army. Some people may say Top Gun. Yeah, I mean, love all those movies. Patton. I mean, the list goes on.
One more movie related. How about sports ones, given what you do now?
Sports ones. So many good choices there as well, but I'll keep it brief. I'll say Field of Dreams. Put that at the top of the list.
Nice.
I thought for sure you'd say Space Jam with LeBron, Rob.
The new one? Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially the new one. Yeah, that's...
Wow. I'm personally a Rudy guy. We're going to move now to the next and third segment, the SOP, or Standard Operating Procedure. In this segment, we're going to talk about the personal routines, habits, and words to live by that have been instrumental to your success. What routines or habits do you have from the military or West Point that you still adhere to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think about standard operating procedures and routines.
You mean you don't wake up and do PT at 5 or 6 every day?
No, I don't. I wish I did.
You and me both.
Ultimately, my job here is the same as being a platoon leader in a lot of regards, right? I mean, it's to provide direction. It's to provide resources. It's to clear the brush so my team can be successful. It's important that I stay close to the business, not micromanage it, but be close enough to appreciate the challenges that my team has and help build, the trust and respect and experience to get things done, let them know that we're all in the trenches together. But otherwise, no day is really the same other than, I guess, the fact that they're all busy. Apart from that, I think it's also important to carve out time to think, reflect, look for news and experiences outside of your direct industry. I think you can get very myopic if you don't do that. So trying to integrate those elements, spending time with your team, but having enough time to take a step back, easier said than done. That's what I try to incorporate on an ongoing basis. There is no 9 to 5, and that certainly has been no truer than over the last 18 to 24 months.
In terms of your West Point military experience, how do you think that's shaped you as a leader?
Beyond the things that we already, touched on, there's definitely a lot of lessons that I use all the time in the business world from my time in the military. I mean, going back to the 82nd, just the rule of LGOPs, little groups of paratroopers, making sure that people understand what the mission and the task is. If people truly internalize that and understand the why, you don't have to micromanage people. You can let them go off and prove to you, how smart and creative and talented they are. And so that's really, informed my leadership style. I think a lot of folks that haven't had experiences like the experiences I had in the military aren't as confident to do things like that, but you have to be confident in your people, but you have to give them direction as well. I think some other sayings that I've taken into my life, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. This is another great one too. I think in the business world, people can tend to run and trip and stumble all over themselves. Taking that pause to think things through, not overanalyze them, but just taking that quick chance to center yourself before you move forward is so critical, because the goal is still speed. It's not to be slow, it's to be fast. But if you act in a chaotic way, you end up just slowing yourself down. And that's as true in the business world as it is when you're clearing a room. And then just, things like 80-20 planning to execute. It's important to plan, and people think about the military, oh, you spend all this time planning. And it's like, no, you got to spend your time practicing and executing. You learn so much more when you're actually out and doing things. I'm not saying you don't plan. You have to at least think through the basics, but like they say, no plan survives the first contact. So it's about getting out there and building that muscle memory and understanding the leading indicators so you can pivot. But it's not overanalyzing things, especially nowadays. You just have to move so fast and have to be able to pivot, so quickly.
Let's move to the next one, which we call giving back. The part of this podcast, and for the listeners, some are currently in the military, some have recently transitioned, and some are building their careers in the space. And Rob, you've been, and Tim too, have been a bit of a mentor to me as I was getting out of the military and into my role in sports. I'm curious if you have any advice or how you think about quote unquote giving back as you've gotten to the place that you are now and in a pretty premium position to be a mentor to others or give a lot of advice. So curious how you think about that now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything that's more important to do on the whole is just to give back. Again, I've been very fortunate in my life and my career to have people that have looked out for me. And I always try to make it a two-way street. I mean, the mentee should be giving as much as the mentor to have an ideal relationship in different ways. But nonetheless, it's definitely an experience that's enriching for both parties. I think earlier in my life at West Point, things like that, I probably didn't take advantage of it as much as I could or should have. Certainly now it's something I take a lot of pride in. And hey, if anyone listening to the podcast ever, has any questions or comments or any way I can be helpful, definitely reach out, because most of the best things that have happened to me, again, both in my life and my career has come through the people that I know more so. And in the way that I've been able to help them first and foremost, the great things have always come from those engagements.
Yeah, I think, and I could be getting this wrong, but I think the way we met actually might have been a cold outreach from me to you on LinkedIn, recognizing the West Point background and the sports stuff. I think that's really an amazing piece of the long gray line here, especially in the civilian world and corporate world now too. Unfortunately, Rob, that's all the time that we have. We could go for hours, but I'm staring at a snowstorm right now and are about to lock the hatchets down. But thanks so much for, the time. Your background is really interesting, incredible, and what you've built as a career post Army is just super interesting. So excited for the listeners to hear this. And yeah, thanks again for making time.
Yeah, thank you guys. I mean, really a treat for you guys to include me in this. Hopefully this was helpful. And like I said, if there's anything I can do for you or any of your listeners, definitely let me know.
Thank you, Rob.
On Point is a production of the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.